Bore da, and thanks for that, those kind words of welcome. One of the things that was said to me when I went into Welsh Government was when you have a change of minister, you're at your most vulnerable. So when Dylan referred to me as extinguished, I thought, well, it's really it's already happening. The other thing, the other advice was given to me was, which has been very helpful, which is never get ahead of your minister, but also not get too far behind them. And when I accepted the invitation to do this presentation, I thought we'd have had a lot longer time to be working with the Minister to start to firm up some of the proposals moving forward. So I have to be careful in what I say today and that I don't get ahead of what the Minister will be pronouncing. So a part of it will be looking back, part of it will be making a judgment as to where I believe we're at, but also part, but not probably not as much as I would have been able to do, had the appointments been made in a more rapid way. We can't go forward without looking, or look about how we go forward without having a glance backwards. I arrived back in Wales after 30 years in England in education in 2012 to work within the EAS. And what I saw, I faced quite quickly, were challenges around across Wales in terms of the local education, the 22 local education authorities, many performing exceptionally well, but the range of performance. The regions were in their very early days, and then we were hit quite early with an OECD report in early 2014, which gave some really hard messages around, the key messages around the impact on the performance of the most vulnerable and the poor. And even also the more able and how we deal for that wide range. The inadequate conditions to nurture excellence in the teaching profession, quite damning. Lack of synergies between assessment on the one hand and evaluation, self-evaluation of schools, but also evaluation of the needs of children as they need to move forward. A lack of long-term clarity in policy and real weak implementation. Things I know that many of the people in the room here, when I was engaging with them during that time, were feeding back to me, and very much too much of a dependency on local authorities, Welsh Government, and others to be told what to do, and even an expectation, although there were significant complaints and concerns around it, and an approach to training and development of individuals, the profession, which was done too. So that's what we were facing, and the real drive and focus of the OECD report was pointing to improvements that were needed to attract the best teachers in Wales, best candidates to the profession, to have a higher quality initial teacher training to develop our young teachers as they come into the profession, to improve both the quality and the impact of continuing professional development, what I touched on earlier in terms of done to and being explained how and what to do, and specifically the capacity of the quality of leadership in Wales. In short, it was really requiring us to develop both the teachers and leaders and their professional capacity across Wales. So some really hard messages, and I thought I was having a bad time in England, and I came over to Wales to hear that, although I guess I had a glimpse of it in terms of coming and working in that initial 12 months. So how did Welsh Government respond? Well, Qualified for Life was probably, not just as a document, but as key principles, was the thing that convinced me I had made the right decision to move. This, in terms of long-term strategy, for me was a key step. It focused on the excellent professional workforce that's required, with a strong focus on pedagogy, and critically in a school-to-school focus, actually learning from what works, because there's a fantastic amount of good work that happens in Wales, but do we learn from what works, particularly around teaching and learning, and I'll come back to that. A curriculum that both engages and attracts children and young people to engage with learning within schools, but also is about, again, critically the application of knowledge and skills and that focus. And leaders at all levels that focusing on a self-improving school system, and that is a foundation which I'll come back to. And the qualifications, both nationally and internationally recognised and respected, and seen as a passport to further and higher education and employment. again, I'll be coming back to that. But one of the key strands running through that was school-to-school work. How did we take that forward? Because there's the foundations, I think, which are here, and I'll come back to that again, the foundations that we've laid for a self-improving system, I believe, started in response to the OECD, and I just want to pick out some of the examples of things that have been happening and how they've impacted on this approach to a self-improving system. And the focus very much of the initial work of the consortia was not to seek the historical solution of providing lots of training courses for people to come to be told what to do. There was a very early investment in school-to-school work. So, for example, hubs, where we identified where it was working. The key first principle, the focus of Qualified for Life. Let's focus on what works. So across Wales, the consortia was starting to look at and starting to develop opportunities. And I can look around this room and see people, heads in this room, who led some of that movement in terms of being willing to put up their hands and share some of that practice. Psychologically, schools being encouraged and then engaging and working with those schools was a critical step to overcome. But I think we've made massive steps in terms of the willingness of schools to engage and share that practice. Categorisation was slated quite often at the beginning because what it didn't do, what it did quite early on was, when we identified relative underperformance, which we complained to you as schools about not having a strategy for closing the gap in terms of the performance within your own schools and the variation in performance. We need to practice what we preach. But the solutions, just in your own schools, is not with an underperforming teacher or an underperforming leader. It's not simply to send them out on a course. You engage with them, and you engage them with the more effective practice within your own school and manage that process, which is about building capacity. And that's what we look to replicate within the consortia, and that I see being well recognised in the report that come out for Central South, and I believe will be recognised in much of the other work that will be seen across the country. So those strong foundations, even in categorisation of linking schools, significant investment in terms of identifying, not just focusing, what's our strategy for underperforming schools, what's our strategy for yellow category schools and green category schools, how do we work with them to ensure that and facilitate them sharing that practice. And that is another significant shift in terms of building this capacity. And that has developed across all 4 consortia, and that underpins the key principle of Welsh Government. We do not concentrate on just looking at bringing up our schools that are struggling in terms of underperformance, but how do we stretch our more able and higher performing schools. As we went forward into 2014 and 15, the other key areas of school-to-school work, historically, introduction of new GCSEs would have about 10 or 15 disciples appointed and go forth across Wales to tell the schools what the changes are in GCSE. That wasn't our approach. It wasn't Welsh Government's approach. They decided to work with the consortia to identify the most effective schools, build their capacity first. That was unheard of in the past. We'd have rushed to look at those who need it most, and we would be the saviours of those schools, whether it be consortia or Welsh Government or local authority historically. What they did was to actually step back and say, how do we invest in our higher performing schools who have some of that capacity to be the best deliverers of those improvements? And that was, again, an important step in terms of school-to-school work, building capacity, a self-improving system. It's investing on where that practice is. That underpinned the whole approach to GCSEs. Similarly, the development of literacy and numeracy, when the CFPT contract was finished, the resources went into the authority, and the regions looked at the investment, that support and how it worked with schools. Schools Challenge Cymru, significant amount of money going into those schools, and I know there's a great deal of concerns, but alongside that, the regions were given, with clear plans, resource to help those schools, or develop those schools who are not School Challenge Cymru schools, who have the capacity to support, to work with them. So the idea that all the investment went to those schools is wrong. We invested money around those schools for some of the practice to support it. Global Futures, the development of the our work on modern foreign languages. Again, massive amount of resource went out to the consortia, identifying the schools that were going to deliver, lead it, to work with those schools to develop them. That was replicated in our work to creative education. And I'm going to come on to Pioneer Schools now, but a Pioneer Schools was the natural extension. But all I wanted to give was a clear picture is this is not new. Consortium were working on school-to-school building capacity 2 years ago. Almost all of the investments made to date, so in the last 2 years, big investments of government of major changes have been built on the premise of schools know best, we need to identify, we need to scaffold around them, but they're deliverers in terms of the future. So it is nothing new. As we look for where we're up to now, I just touched on Pioneer Schools. So how are we approaching probably internationally one of the biggest projects in terms of development of education, that's the Successful Futures? Well, we're building on the learning from what happened in the last 2 years in terms of what works with bringing in new initiatives. The Pioneer Schools, the digital competency framework, the balance between bringing in external expertise and giving the ownership to schools is a fine balance, which I'm going to touch on again. Building the capacity within our schools and creating the conditions, what we've called New Deal schools, and we are looking at, prompted by a number of people both within the profession and outside of it, to look hard at that, and we're engaged with the Minister in looking at that. But what I would say there is that the principles which underpin the New Deal and underpin the New Deal are not different to what I've just outlined in terms of capacity building, identifying where the best practice is, giving entitlement to people to engage with that. So there has been significant investment in the development of the profession through all the strategies I've touched on before. So those who are waiting for masses of new money and a new strategy which says this is the New Deal, this is how we're supporting the development of the workforce. The strategy is being built over 2 years, and millions of pounds have gone into that strategy. I guess from a Welsh Government perspective, which I take responsibility for, we need to get a better narrative and greater clarity as to how that fits and how we position that going forward and how that's going to be developed further, particularly through our Pioneer School movement. The other focus in our shift in our work as far as the Successful Futures is the significant amount of focus on the relationship between assessment and evaluation, and particularly assessment and accountability. And this is an area where I believe you will see some important shifts as we move forward. The Minister is very keen to challenge us within the system as to how we get that balance between accountability and assessment. And the key principle in Professor Donaldson's report on the focus on assessment for learning and not getting confusions. And I can point to a significant amount of work that's been done on that, and that will emerge as we move forward in the next 6-12 months as to how that will impact on the professional development of staff and the professional development of leaders and the capacity of our schools. The other big focus is our approach to initial teacher education, and we are taking important recommendations that emerged from the previous work, and they will be going through the system soon to look at what impact that will have in delivering on our teachers as teachers that are coming into the profession. And again, I can point to the focus of that and the learning is, it goes back to that school-to-school work. We need to ensure that the teachers who are going to be coming into schools in Wales and delivering in Wales have had access to and being exposed to the realities of teaching and learning, but also the best practice. And there's a fine line. We don't want to exclude schools. There's a fine line to be drawn there. And the focus and input of our best schools to the development of our teachers is a critical feature of that approach. So what are the stresses at the moment? What are the challenges around developing or further this system? I think that the balance between the focus on pioneer schools, and I'm trying to find another term for non-pioneer schools because it has that label and it doesn't sound good, and there's a lot of our schools who are not pioneers by badge, are actually pioneers in lots of other ways. So we are working hard at how we do that. But the balance between giving that freedom to go and do that work and providing the expertise that goes alongside, external expertise go alongside. I'm going to touch on that later in terms of how that is different to the way the work that was done in Scotland is being done in Scotland. I touched on the greater clarity on our training and professional development, the New Deal, and that again will be coming soon. The HE contribution, not just in terms of initial teacher education. My desire is for far greater involvement and engagement of higher education within research, working alongside the work that we're doing on Donaldson and initial teacher education. So they bring that research to balance the work, the day-to-day work that you're doing within schools. Quite significantly, Graham Donaldson, I know some of the people in this room were at the presentation a week last Monday that was delivered through the Education Workforce Council, and Graham related to the difference between an implementation strategy and a realisation strategy. An implementation strategy tends to imply it's done to. A realisation strategy is something that you actually have to work collaboratively together to actually deliver it. Now we need to exemplify how that will work, but fundamentally the foundations are the balance of accountability and the balance of responsibility. But fundamentally it is the focus will be on the schools and the profession to come up with a solution, guided and supported by external expertise that we will look to facilitate for them. I'm going to finish really with some quick comparisons, because I know there's something recently being looked at. Well, why are we doing everything in Scotland the same as Scotland are doing, and Scotland are now changing things? There are some fundamental differences between our approach to successful features, the curriculum, and Scotland. And the first is we have a pioneer school system, a structure and an infrastructure that works to develop it in partnership. We have brought a degree of expertise, national and international, and some of them are speaking to you today, to challenge and support the profession in delivering that. And for me, fundamentally, the difference, one of the key sentences in the evaluation of Scotland's work before Christmas, the OECD report, talked about the lack of an effective middle. And what I described in terms of the last 2 or 3 years' work, both in terms of what regions are doing, what Welsh Government are doing, and investing the money out there with schools, building that capacity, that is the effective middle. The effective middle is our schools working collaboratively to come up with the solutions. Yes, with funding, yes, with support, but ultimately they are the middle tier. So in terms of building a self-improving system, where do I think we are in Wales? Where do I think we are in Welsh Government? I think we've got really, really strong foundations, but we are still at those early stages. And we are going to need to hold our nerve, because we are going to go through some challenges. There are implications around some of the challenges of the introduction of new examination results and what emerges from that in terms of performance as we move forward over the next two or 3 years. I think the prize is worth waiting for in holding our nerve, but as a profession we need to balance that, our own individual commitment, but our commitment to each other for a self-improving system. It's a self-improvement system where government recognises that the investment and the delivery arm is out there. A system where regions learn from each other in terms of what's working, what's not working. A system where the local authorities work collaboratively and learn from each other. And fundamentally, a system that's based on schools know best, and the trick and the strategy is around a scaffolding system to ensure that works, both at delivery level within schools, but also at a national level in terms of policy development and critically policy implementation, because it was the implementation the OECD criticised so significantly. Last thing is will be working with OECD. We're not waiting for another 3 or 4 years before we'll be engaging them to come back to look and test some of the work that we're doing. So in short, it's an exciting time to be involved, and as I look at the timetable today, I'd be delighted to stay and listen and work with all of them, but as Nedwyn says, business takes me elsewhere. But I look forward to working with you after today and as we go forward in future years. It's on a really exciting agenda, and you'll deliver it, but I think there's really strong foundations there for us to work with you on it. Thank you.